The phone buzzed on the counter and skidded. Steam lifted from the chipped mug in pale ribbons. The fridge hummed and the ceiling light flickered. A banner slid down and burned my eyes. Not a priority, my mom wrote, cold and flat. I'm Eli, 18, and my hands shook. The spoon knocked the bowl and rang like cheap metal. Morning smelled like burnt toast and dish soap. The cracked case pressed my palm like a stone. I stared at her words and tasted copper. I typed fast with my thumb and missed letters. Please, I wrote, and the keyboard clicked harshly. The screen threw blue light across the countertop. A paper towel stuck wet to my wrist. I asked about my birth certificate and waited. Another buzz hit the butcher block and rattled. The toaster ticked and gave a thin breath. Later, she wrote, and my chest tightened. I watched the message bubble die like a spark. Silence filled the kitchen like thick foam. I pulled a drawer and found an empty folder. Dust lifted in the lamplight and tasted stale. A rubber band snapped against my fingertip. There was no seal and no faded form. The folder bent in my grip like skin. I opened my laptop and woke the keys. The fan whirred and pushed warm plastic air. A green tree icon blinked on the screen. A notification waited with a red dot. Pending match, it said, and my pulse kicked. I clicked and saw a blurred profile tile. The cursor blinked in a small gray box. Coffee went bitter on my tongue and lingered. The trackpad felt greasy under my thumb. I wrote a greeting and erased it twice. Footsteps thumped the hall and stopped short. My sister patted in with a cereal bowl. Happy birthday, she said, and the milk sloshed. I closed the lid and wiped the counter. She watched my hands and frowned at the phone. What did she say? My sister asked. Her spoon scraped the rim like a slow saw. She said later, I said, and looked away. I straightened the salt shaker with 2 fingers. The window threw gray light across the sink. She always says later, my sister muttered. She popped the cereal box and the bag crackled. Sugar's smell rose and coated the back of air. I tapped the phone and kept the screen dim. She chewed and eyed the closed laptop lid. Want eggs? I asked and grabbed the pan. The burner clicked and a flame snapped bright. Oil hissed and climbed the room like a snake. My wrist brushed the handle and felt heat. She shook her head and left without looking back. The kitchen went quiet except for the fan. A birthday card stood on the table like a sign. I touched the folded edge and felt the ridge. The ink smeared under my thumb like rain. I leaned over the phone and opened the app. I typed 1 line and watched the dots. Hi, I wrote, and my throat worked. Grease smoke curled and stung my eyes. The egg bubbled, then I killed the flame. The message waited in the little gray box. The fridge motor kicked and made a low drone. A magnet held a receipt that curled like bark. I rubbed the thin crescent scar on my wrist. The skin felt slick from oil and nerves. My heartbeat thudded against the wooden stool. Another text cut through the hum like a blade. Do not press me, my mom wrote slowly. The screen flashed and the cracked line glittered. I placed the knife on the board by habit. I breathed once and tasted the cold metal. A car alarm barked outside and then died. The window glass carried street noise and ripples. I lifted the phone and squared my shoulders. The blue send arrow waited like a trigger. My thumb hovered and shook in the light. I typed the second line and stopped hard. I think we match, I wrote, clipped and plain. The mug rim felt rough against my lip. Coffee cooled and turned sour on my tongue. The draft glowed and pulled me forward. My dad texted balloons and a thumbs up. The vibration slid the card a half inch. I put the phone face down for a breath. The wood felt damp and sticky under my palm. Then I turned it over and saw the draft. My mother's name lit again with a ping. Not a priority, she wrote like the first one. The oven clock blinked 6:41 in dull green. The pan smelled like cooled oil and iron. I angled the phone until the glare vanished. I added a last line with tight fingers. I just need the truth, I wrote, steady now. Light from the bulb haloed dust in the air. The salt shaker caught a spark and glittered. The box trembled under my thumb like a wire. Footsteps creaked upstairs and then settled flat. The hallway nightlight cast a thin gold stripe. I pocketed the phone and felt its warmth. The folded card rocked once on the table. I pulled it back with one finger and waited. I felt the room tilt and then steady. The air smelled like toast gone to ash. I lifted the phone and squared my grip. A single bead of sweat slid into my sleeve. I exhaled slow and touched the blue arrow. The sound was small and final like a click. The screen flashed white and then cooled blue. The progress bar slid and stopped at the edge. The cursor went still and the box emptied. Message sent, the banner said, and the house held its breath. The buzz hit the counter and spun the phone. White light washed my knuckles and the cracked glass. A new chat popped with a gray circle avatar. Someone typed slowly, then stopped, then typed again. A sharp ping cut through the humming kitchen air. I flipped the phone and wiped my thumb. Hi Eli, the message read in careful dots. Mark here, it added with a tiny cursor. I pressed call and felt the case slip slightly. Static hissed, then a low male breath answered. Metal clinked in his background like falling sockets. Hello, he said with a voice tight like wire. You sent a match, he said slow and cautious. Yeah, I said while gripping the edge of the counter. The laminate felt damp and sticky under my palm. What is your name? I asked and steadied. Mark, he said as a door squeaked behind. A citrus cleaner smell drifted through his phone speaker. I heard music faint through a dusty radio. I need to ask you something, he said now. Go, I said while shifting beside the pan. Do you have a crescent scar on your wrist? The vent rattled above the stove and clicked. My fingers found a ridge and gripped the towel. Yes, I said as the room shrank tight. Good, he said, then breathed like bracing. A socket clattered on concrete near his voice. The phone glass warmed my cheek like a bruise. I think we share a father, he said. A siren wailed outside and smeared across the window. I kept my eyes on the stainless sink. Say his name, I said as words grew heavy. Victor, he said as the line went quiet. The bulb hummed and threw a flat yellow cone. Water beaded on the rim of the glass. My tongue stuck to my teeth like dull glue. I have a photo, he said and paused. A tone chimed and the screen flashed white. A man stared from a shop with a red wrench. The image smelled like hot dust through my head. He looks like me, I said while breathing shallow. A chain hung behind him and caught the light. Who is that? I asked while tapping once. That is Victor, he said before static surged. Where are you? I asked because I can come. Rainside Auto, he said under the green sign. A compressor thumped behind him and shook his words. I am 2 blocks away, I said and moved. I killed the flame and grabbed my jacket. Heat faded from the pan and left a smell. My keys scraped the bowl and rang bright. I tucked the photo under the magnet and swallowed. Wait, he said, and bring the bracelet if possible. The hallway smelled like laundry near the plastic basket. I opened the junk drawer and found an old box. Cardboard rasped my fingertips and flaked gritty specks. I said, but I can check. The drawer smelled like pennies and lemon cleaner. A tangle of keys clicked against a dull battery. I slammed it shut and headed for the door. Bring anything with dates, he said steady again. The call crackled and then dropped to silence. The phone screen showed the timer and a smear. Rain hit the porch roof in fast slaps. I stuffed the phone in my jacket pocket. The air smelled like wet asphalt and cold iron. I pulled the doorknob and stepped into the dark. Rain hammered the porch roof like fists. I cut left toward the garage door fast. The handle felt slick with cold water. Hinges screamed and the dark breathed in. I slapped the switch and the bulb shivered. Light spread thin over a sagging workbench. The air smelled like wet cardboard and oil. Dust rose and twirled like gnats around a nail. I towed a paint can and heard it slosh. A drop ran down the label and glimmered. The concrete felt gritty through my sneakers. I scanned the pegboard for a small box. The old ladder leaned by a coil of hose. I dragged it aside and scraped the floor. Rubber burned my palms and left a bite. Something tapped inside the wall like a trapped bug. Where are you going? My sister whispered. Her voice slipped through the crack like smoke. She held a flashlight with a blue stripe. I pointed at the shelves and kept moving. Help me look, I said with a nod. She flicked the beam across hanging bicycles. Light found a stack of faded moving boxes. The tape peeled with a papery sigh and grit. Inside lay Christmas lights and a stapler. They smelled like attic dust and old plastic. I shoved them aside and felt a stiff envelope. The corner cut my finger and drew a bead. "You okay?" she asked with the beam steady. I sucked the sting and tasted iron. The envelope had a torn return address. I slid it free and saw a hospital logo. The bulb hummed and threw a circle wider. The seal had already been ripped jagged. Paper rasped my skin and left a film. I pulled a receipt with a cash amount. "Is that important?" she asked and leaned closer. The flashlight warmed my wrist like a brand. I held the slip to the light and squinted. The date matched my birthday, and I froze. We both listened to rain thud on the roof. A drip tapped the metal trash can steady. She tucked a strand behind her ear slow. I slipped the receipt into my jacket pocket. "Keep looking," I said and nudged a crate. Wood creaked, and a spider scuttled under a rag. The smell shifted to rubber and metal shavings. There was another box pushed behind a cooler. I hauled it out and tore the brittle tape. Cardboard flaked and made my hands dusty. A Polaroid stared from the top like an eye. I set it on the bench and felt my pulse jump. The picture showed a nurse station in harsh light. A plastic name tag shone on a clip pocket. A clipboard leaned on the counter with a pen. The rest was blur and white like glare. "Turn it over," my sister said softly. The back had a rush of ink and numbers. The ink smelled faintly like old marker. A date and a time had been underlined. I dug deeper and found a plastic band. It clung to a folded baby blanket like ivy. The blanket felt thin and slightly damp. Raised letters pressed into the band with a name. "Is that it?" she asked and held the beam. Her breath fogged in the cold garage air. I read the tiny print and felt a shiver. The letters matched what I needed and more. The phone vibrated against my thigh and buzzed. Light bled through my pocket and pulsed. I fumbled the device and smeared the screen. A new message asked me to bring proof. "Who was that?" she asked and stepped closer. A droplet hit the lens and ran like a tear. I wiped it with my sleeve and sniffed. "Someone from the shop," I said with care. "Take the band," he texted with a short buzz. The font glowed stark against the black glass. The garage smelled sharper like cut metal now. "Got it," I wrote and closed my fist. We sifted the bottom and hit something rigid. My knuckles clanged a tin with a dent. It scraped the box and squealed thinly. Inside lay a small key on a tag. "What key is that?" she asked and tilted. The flashlight kissed the stamped letter slowly. The metal felt icy and gritty in my hand. A single letter V stared up like a brand. A gust rattled the garage door and growled. The bulb swayed and threw dizzy shadows. My shoulder brushed the pegboard and shook a wrench. We both looked at the key and did not speak. I lifted a notebook with a wire spine. The cover stuck to my fingers like glue. Pages smelled like basements and spilled coffee. A single line read "Check locker after hours." "Locker where?" she asked with her head tilted. The beam fell on a business card wedged. White edges peeked from a cracked manila folder. I pried it loose and let my breath out. The card read "Rainside Auto" in thick ink. A greased thumbprint smudged the corner like smoke. A phone number ran down the bottom edge. The letters rippled under the bulb like heat. Another vibration crawled up my leg again. Tiny drumbeats tapped through denim and bone. I glanced down and saw 3 new dots. "Waiting," he typed, and my chest tightened hard. I tucked the band and key into my pocket. The plastic pressed warm against my thigh. The metal clicked against my lighter once. I folded the Polaroid and slid it behind the receipt. "Mom will lose it," my sister whispered fast. The rain smell crept in through the gap. She gripped the flashlight and looked at the door. I nodded and grabbed the battered shoebox too. We killed the bulb and let dark settle. Streetlight crawled through the window like milk. The workbench faded to a shape and outline. I heard the hose drip and counted the drops. We crept across the concrete and hugged the wall. My shoulder brushed a hanging helmet and squeaked. Cold air licked my cheek near the latch. I eased the door open and felt the hinge tremble. "Text me when you get there," she said quietly. Her hand touched my sleeve and held. Laundry soap smell clung to her sweatshirt and lingered. I squeezed her fingers and slipped into the rain. Water slapped my hood and ran down. Streetlights washed the driveway with silver plates. Gravel shifted under my soles like glass. I checked the key again in my palm. Headlights swept across the siding and vanished. A dog barked down the block and echoed. The shoebox knocked my ribs with a hollow thud. I tucked it closer and kept moving fast. At the porch, I paused and reached sideways. The kitchen window showed the card on the table. Its edge caught the light like a blade. I slipped inside and snatched it under breath. My phone glowed and buzzed once in warning. Battery low flashed red above the time. The cord snaked across the counter near the mug. I plugged in for 10 seconds and watched the bar crawl. "Come on," I whispered and tapped the screen. The scent of old coffee clung to the rim. A water ring spread under the charger block. The number ticked up by a sliver, enough. I grabbed the jacket and zipped to my chin. The zipper teeth scraped and sparked faintly. The band pressed against my leg like a coin. The key bit into my palm and felt right. The front door opened with a slow groan. A neighbor engine coughed then settled to idle. Rain beat it on the doormat and glittered. I stepped out and pulled it tight behind me. The street carried the smell of wet tar. A bus hissed near the corner and flashed. I checked the business card under the streetlight. The letters shone and the route sharpened like fate. Rain slapped the neon sign until it buzzed. Red letters bled across puddles like smeared paint. I pushed the glass door and felt cold metal. A bell jittered above me and kept ringing. Warm oil smell rolled from the open bay. A radio hissed near a dented toolbox. Fluorescent light flickered and painted long shadows. A red wrench lay on the counter like a warning. Footsteps scraped concrete behind a hanging tarp. Mark stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. The rag left dark streaks across his knuckles. He watched the door swing and said nothing. "Over here," he said and tapped the counter. His voice carried under the rattling vent fan. I set the business card beside a bolt. Its corner lifted in the breath from the fan. "You came fast," he said and looked past me. A compressor kicked on and shook the floor. I nodded once and reached inside my pocket. The plastic band clicked against my keys like teeth. "Let me see," he said and held out. The work light hummed in blue-white heat. I laid the band next to his socket. He leaned close and squinted, then glanced up. "This looks right," he said with a swallow. Rubber fumes pressed against the back of my throat. He tapped the raised letters with a fingernail. The tap sounded tiny and cruel in the room. "Do you still have that key?" he asked. I opened my fist and felt cold bite. The stamped V winked under the strip light. Metal clicked against the counter and rolled once. "Come with me," he said and moved. We passed a rolling jack with peeling paint. Water dripped from my hood in steady beats. The droplets pattered on a drain like coins. He led me to lockers against a cinder wall. The fluorescent buzz deepened and made my scalp itch. Each door had numbers scratched with knives. One door held a small V near the latch. I touched the metal and felt grit. The chill spread through my fingertips like frost. The key slid in with a small scrape. The lock turned and stuck, then turned again. The door swung and breathed a stale smoke. Darkness pooled inside like a cut pocket. Mark clicked a pen light and probed the shelf. A dented tin sat beside a cracked visor. "Lift it," he said and stepped back. The tin rasped and shed gray dust. The lid fought, then gave with a pop. Inside lay a spark plug and a folded envelope. The envelope scratched my palms with dry edges. It smelled like old receipts and machine heat. A name scratched the front in heavy strokes. Two letters stood alone and waited. "V and M." "Open it," he said with eyes on my hands. The penlight wobbled and splashed the metal. I slid a finger under the flap and tore. Paper opened like a mouth and held still. A single note sat inside like a blade. Ink bled in lines under the thin beam. "For the boy, Friday, 4 p.m., it read. "Bring band to locker and wait," it ended. "That's not from today," he said softly. The clock over the bay ticked louder. Dust swirled across the beam like gray snow. He looked at the note and then at me. "There's more," he said and bent lower. His sleeve brushed metal and left a squeak. He pulled a Polaroid from a torn envelope. A red X marked a calendar behind a desk. The photo smelled like plastic and sweet chemicals. A clipboard leaned beside the calendar on metal. The date circled matched a Friday in red. A thumbprint smeared the corner like smoke. "Flip it," he said and passed it over. My glove stuck to the back like tape. Two words scratched the surface with pressure. "Door code under mat lobby," it said. We shut the locker and followed a hallway. The lights hummed and stuttered behind stained glass. A metal door waited with a rubbed silver knob. The mat curled at one corner like a tongue. I lifted the mat and found a keypad. Grease darkened the plastic like old rain, for numbers showed where under the dull light. I pressed them slow and hoped they were right. The latch coughed and pushed the door open. Warm air slid out carrying rubber and coffee. A dusty ficus leaned against a filing cabinet. An office lamp threw a yellow puddle over paperwork. We stepped inside and closed the door quietly. The lamp shade felt rough when I brushed it. Papers rattled under the draft from the vent. A metal fan hummed on the bookshelf like a warning. "Look there," he said and pointed at drawer 14. The cabinet handle was slick with shop grime. A stamped 4 dug into my thumb pad. The drawer groaned and opened in one hard tug. Folders slid and thumped the sides like dull drums. The paper smell made my eyes water fast. A manila folder wore a corner bent white. A black marker read VM with a quick hand. I eased it open and found a pawn ticket. The ink was faint but still burned black. Pawn King was stamped above a small crown. One line read "Watch held until claim," it warned. "Why a watch?" he asked and stared at it. The lamp hummed and ticked as it heated. I held the ticket and felt the thin stock. A phone number curled along the bottom edge. Behind the ticket lay a narrow receipt book. Carbon sheets crackled like thin ice under fingers. The top slip showed a cash advance note. A grease ring stained the corner like a moon. Thunder rolled outside and shook the high windows. The office glass wobbled and creaked inside the frame. Headlights swept the blinds and striped the desk. Mark killed the lamp with 2 quick taps. A voice called from the bay with a cough. The smell of cigarettes pushed under the door. Boot steps clanged on a rolling creeper nearby. A shadow crossed the window like a blade. "You closing up?" a man called in a drawl. Mark opened the door a crack and nodded. "5 minutes," he said with his voice steady. I slid the folder shut and steadied my breath. The footsteps retreated and kicked a bucket. The clang rang against the tiled wall. I felt the grit under my shoe soles. The folder's edge dug into my palm like a rule. "We need the claim," Mark said barely above air. The fluorescent buzz returned like a swarm. He tapped the ticket and pointed to the clock. We still had minutes before everything locked. I checked my phone and felt the vibration. Blue light washed my fingers like shallow water. A new message glowed against the cracked glass. "Do not go there," my mom wrote hard. My throat dried and stuck for a second. The fan blades chopped the air above us. I slipped the ticket into my jacket pocket. The paper rasped my knuckle and drew a line. "She knows," he said and watched my face. The office light threw ridges across the desk. I closed the drawer and pressed it flush. The cabinet clanged once and echoed down the hall. "Take the envelope, too," he said quickly now. The tin waited in my other hand like weight. I slid the note inside and folded it. The metal lid snapped shut with a bright click. We stepped back into the humming bay together. A chrome bumper reflected our faces like water. Air tasted like antifreeze and old rags. 2 sockets rolled under a cart and hid. The front door creaked and let cold drift. The bell rattled a weak jingle over concrete. I tucked my hood and lowered my head. A police cruiser idled outside and spilled blue lines. Mark wiped the counter and stacked a clipboard. He dropped the rag and it slapped wetly. The neon sign buzzed harder and spit light. I slipped toward the side exit with a tin. "Text me when safe," he said under breath. The compressor sighed and the shop settled. I pushed the metal bar and felt it stick. The door finally yielded and opened into rain. I cut into the rain and ran. Streetlights smeared silver across the soaked trash bin. Water hammered my hood and slid cold. The side gate yawned open like a mouth. Tires hissed near the cruiser at the curb. Blue wash flickered across an overflowing newspaper stand. I kept my eyes down and moved fast. The metal tin knocked my thigh like a warning. An alley stank of rot behind a diner. Steam curled from a vent and licked brick. A chain-link fence rattled under my wrist. I climbed and dropped hard on slick gravel. Neon glowed ahead like a wet brand. Pawn King buzzed and spit a red halo. The glass door wore rain like running veins. I grabbed the handle and pulled hard. A bell clanged above the counter twice. Bleach smell floated over old carpet glue. Fluorescence hummed and shook the ceiling tiles. A plastic fan turned slow behind a case. "We are closing," the clerk said and frowned. He wiped a ring on the glass countertop. His name tag flashed under the bright light. He leaned forward and watched my wet jacket. "I have a ticket," I said and swallowed. Paper rasped my fingers as I unfolded it. The counter felt gritty under my knuckles. He held out 2 fingers for the slip. He read slowly and tapped a chipped calculator. The machine chirped while the ceiling vent rattled. He scratched his ear and glanced at the clock. The ticket edge wilted in my damp grip. "Name," he said and clicked his tongue. The receipt printer whined and stopped short. I spread my hand and lifted the band. Plastic brushed my skin and squeaked in light. "That counts," he said after a long beat. He sniffed and looked at my soaked shoes. The backroom door creaked on a tired hinge. A key ring jingled against a hook. "ID," he said and held out. I slid a school card across the glass. The laminate stuck and left a fog print. He squinted and rubbed the corner with cloth. He stamped a form with a dull thud. Ink smeared his thumb in a dark crescent. The smell of toner hung under the lights. He nodded once and vanished through the door. I listened to boxes slide in the back. Metal scraped shelves like slow thunder in a tunnel. A clock ticked hard above a cracked poster. My breath fogged the glass and hid the pawns. He returned carrying a gray tray. A sealed bag lay beside a brass tag. The zipper hissed and let out stale air. Inside waited a heavy watch like a stone. He set the tray down and stepped back. Light crawled across the face and winked. The second hand ticked with a stubborn click. Cold metal chilled my fingerprints and held tight. He said a kid might come, the clerk said. He flipped a small booklet on the counter. The paper smelled sweet like printer glue. He signed once and pushed me a stub. "Who said that?" I asked and steadied. He rubbed his neck and watched the camera. A red diode blinked above the glass case. He lowered his voice like folding a blade. "Guy who pawned it," he said and swallowed. "He left a note," he said and turned. He reached under the counter with slow fingers. An envelope slid out like a flat fish. Wax smell rose as I touched the seal. The paper felt thick with a grain. A faint imprint bulged under the surface. He nodded once and wiped a smudge again. "Only if kid shows the band," he said. His breath carried coffee and spearmint gum. He tapped the envelope with a dull nail. "He said the kid would know," he said. The bell clinked as wind pressed the door. Streetlights spilled a pale stripe across tile. A newspaper page fluttered near a jar. The clerk eyed the blue flash outside and frowned. "Police already asked about him," he said. He adjusted the camera with 2 careful fingers. The lens reflected the counter and my hands. He slid me a scratched pen and waited. "What did you tell them?" I asked low. The printer coughed and spat a thin receipt. He shrugged and pointed at the sign on rules. "Nothing without papers," he said and blinked. The watch strap felt rough against my skin. Leather smell climbed as I tightened the buckle. The weight settled on my wrist like truth. The ticking burrowed through bone and stayed. I cracked the seal and lifted the flap. Paper whispered against paper like dry leaves. Fluorescent light poured into the crease. 3 numbers and an address glared back. Bay storage C12 to NIDA after close. The ink dug grooves into the fiber. A small key code followed in sharp strokes. My throat clicked as I read it twice. The clerk watched my eyes and then nodded. He placed a plastic bag on the counter. Zip ties and a tiny screwdriver nestled inside. He pushed it closer and lowered his chin. "He told me to add that," he said. "Only if the kid looked ready," he added. The screwdriver handle felt warm from his hand. A faint oil smell rose off the tools. "Ready for what?" I asked and breathed slow. The bell rang, once as wind leaned hard. Rain whispered under the door like snakes. He rolled a coin between his fingers and watched. Whatever he left inside it, he said. He motioned at the watch in the light. A hairline seam circled the polished back. The second hand kept chopping the moment in half. I set the watch on the glass carefully. The screwdriver bit the notch with a tick. My fingers slid and then caught grip. The back turned with a soft metal sigh. A thin foam pad peeled up like skin. Under it lay a folded scrap of paper. The pad smelled faintly like new shoes. The clerk leaned closer without touching anything. I teased the scrap free with short nails. My fingertips tingled against the tiny edge. Light poured across, ink cramped and slanted. Bring watch to C12, door inside, alone. Something else hid under the scrap like glitter. A micro SD card winked in the light. It stuck to the foam with static hiss. I lifted it with the screwdriver tip carefully. You saw nothing, the clerk said quietly. The camera hummed above us like a bee. He slid a small plastic sleeve across the glass. I dropped the card inside and shut it. He pushed a receipt toward me for a sign. My pen scratched the box and left a hook. The paper curled from damp sleeve against wrist. He blew on the ink and glanced at the door. Take the back exit, he said and pointed. The corridor smelled like mopped linoleum and metal. A bare bulb burned over a delivery scale. He unlocked a bolt and stepped aside. Thank you, I said and tucked the envelope. My jacket clung cold against my ribs. The watch ticked steady near the plastic sleeve. He nodded and pulled the bolt back tight. The alley was darker than the street. A dumpster lid thudded under wind like thunder. I kept one hand around the plastic sleeve. Water streamed from a conduit like a rope. My phone buzzed bright in the wet dark. The screen lit raindrops like hot sparks. A new text glared through the smear. Do not move, my mom wrote again. I wiped the glass with my cuff once. Rain streaked the corner and blurred the edges. Blue light from the cruiser washed the bricks. I slid the message away and kept walking. A dog barked through a fence with a rattle. The smell of wet cedar came off the slats. My boot hit a bottle and sent it spinning. It flashed once and vanished under a car. The storage address burned behind my eyes. A bus sighed 2 blocks over like a beast. I gripped the envelope until the edges bit. The watch face glowed and refused to stop. I reached the corner and waited a breath. Traffic lights pulsed red across an empty bench. The rain softened to a steady whisper. I lifted my hood and tasted cold air. A taxi rolled by and threw muddy spray. The meter blinked green under the fogged windshield. I raised my hand and stepped from shadow. The driver squinted and cracked the window down. Base storage, I said and held the sleeve. He sniffed and glanced at the address twice. The seat stuck to my jacket like tape. He nodded and hit the turn signal hard. We pulled away as sirens rose behind. Heads-up display, glow washed the dash blue. Wipers slapped and carved clear tunnels of light. I held the envelope and watched the watch. The taxi braked hard at the metal gate. Wipers thumped and smeared streetlight on the windshield. A keypad blinked red under a wet awning. I stepped out and tasted exhaust and rain. I tapped the code and watched the light switch. The beep sounded thin under the drumming storm. Chain links rattled as the gate dragged open. A yellow bollard glistened like a warning in fog. Fluorescence buzzed along the empty corridor. Concrete smelled like bleach and damp cardboard. A camera glowed red above a map. I lifted my hood and kept to the wall. Unit letters climbed the cinder blocks in order. C numbers lined up under a flickering tube. My shoes squeaked past a rolling dolly. C12 waited with a steel latch and dust. The padlock was a wheel with worn numbers. Cold metal bit my fingertips through wet cloth. I spun the 3 digits from the note. The shackle popped with a small snap, open. The door groaned up and breathed stale air. A string light dangled over stacked crates. Mildew lifted sweet and sour off tarps. I pulled a cord and flooded the unit yellow. A duffel slumped beside a dented fan. Its canvas felt gritty under my knuckles. The zipper teeth scraped like a zipper of bones. Inside lay a cheap phone and a charger. An envelope sat beneath the phone like bedrock. The paper rasped my skin as I slid it. The light made the crease glow like a vein. For the kid was scrawled in block letters. I cracked the flap and found a keycard. The plastic smelled like new vinyl in heat. A logo read County Health with a swipe strip. A date ribboned the corner with last winter. The burner phone chimed as I held it. Its screen washed blue across the duffel seam. A slot waited under a rubber tab. I slid the micro card in and swallowed. Files blinked alive with blocky names. One red ledger one with a green icon. Static hissed when a tiny speaker engaged. A voice cut through like gravel in glass. "Stop after payment," the voice said cold. The fan blade ticked against its cage. "He doesn't want calls," the voice said flat. Paper scuffed nearby as I shifted my foot. "Who was he?" a second voice asked softer. The string light hummed and swung slightly. "Your sponsor," the first voice said with grit. "Take the watch and lock C12. It ended." I backed against a crate and felt staples. Cardboard rasped my jacket shoulder in rough streaks. A plastic milk crate sat under a tarp. Inside lay stubs from money orders in rows. I lifted one stub and smelled old ink. The amount matched the pawn slip totals. A surname bled through in heavy pen strokes. It was mine, written by a different hand. Footsteps scuffed outside with a rubber squeal. Keys jingled and a golf cart hummed past. A beam slid under the door like a blade. I killed the light and held my breath. Closing sweep, a man called down the row. His voice bounced off metal doors in waves. The cart beeped as it reversed and paused. I gripped the phone until plastic warmed. The beam moved on and the hum faded. Rain thrummed faint through the tin roof. I tugged the cord and light returned weakly. Dust danced inside the cone like small ghosts. A plastic file box sat behind a trunk. Its lid buckled under my thumb and popped. Chemical smell rose off old laminate sheets. On top lay a hospital visitor badge. The badge caught light and showed a scrawl. A clipped initial matched the envelope's mark. The sticker edge curled like a dried leaf. A timestamp lined up with the ledger entry. I reached deeper and found a tape recorder. The rubber buttons felt soft and crumbly. I hit play and heard air and paper. Then breath, then a name swallowed by static. The tape squealed and stalled like a dying bird. I flipped it and wound with my nail. The reel clicked once and then flowed. A whisper said meet alone by the door. My phone buzzed hot in my pocket. Blue light washed the crate with cold glow. Two new texts stacked on the cracked glass. Both from the same number. "Dad, where are you?" he wrote with clipped words. The unit smelled tighter, like trapped heat. "Pick up now," he wrote as the cart returned. I stared at his name and watched the beam grow.